Today I want to talk about the autopsies that were conducted on the body of Kendrick Johnson. There were 3 total. 2 were in 2013 and 1 was in 2018. First, I want to draw your attention to this article in USA Today, Murder Allegations Sidelines. Football Player's Career Divides Community. It's by Ray Gleer and Eric Brady. In it, you can find interviews with the Johnson family, their attorney, coach at Lowndes High School, the Bell family, the president of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, Reverend Floyd Rose. But I want to draw your attention to this part right here. Evidence indicates accident. If you come down to this part, there is a sentence right here from the private pathologist who conducted the 2nd and 3rd autopsies on Kendrick. There is no evidence he was beaten, Anderson said. It was probably just a single pressure application. Okay, so I'm going to go over some of the issues with the Anderson autopsy first, and then I'll come back to the GBI autopsy. Okay, Anderson was in private practice. I don't know if he still is. He was not with a state agency when he conducted the autopsy on Kendrick Johnson's body. He conducted it in June 2013, which was approximately five and a half months after KJ died. The first autopsy by Mary Ann Gaffney Craft at the GBI was conducted in January 2013, about 4 to 5 days after he died. And keep in mind, his body was inside a mat for approximately 21 hours, dead, decomposing, before he was found and the body put in a body cooler. And it was longer than that, because I believe the body had to stay in the gym while the crime scene investigators processed the scene, and I think that took at least 6 hours, if not longer. Okay, so Anderson renders a conclusion of blunt force trauma, more investigation needed. The problem with that is, if you go to the case file, there is 0 supporting evidence. There's no physical evidence, there's no video evidence, and there's no credible witness testimony to support blunt force trauma. So just because you say, hey, I found a bruise, therefore, you can't say, therefore he was murdered. You have to have something else that proves murder. That alone will not prove anything. Okay, so then he's accused of lying and conducting private work on company time when he was at the Florida Department of Law Enforcement. And so these are accusations of unethical conduct. Okay, so right there it goes to credibility because of that. And I couldn't find any accusations against Mary Ann Gaffney Craft of lying or conducting autopsies on company time. In interviews with media and podcasters, Anderson says he was not beaten, and I just showed you where you can find at least one of these statements from him. And he says that the cause of death was blunt force trauma less than 1 inch, which probably was a single pressure application that stopped the heart. And yet he presented no medical publications to back up this finding of his, because a cause of death like that has never been recorded, to the best of my understanding, in someone that was 17 years old. Now, Mary Ann Gaffney Craft, she did provide documents in her report that backed up what she was saying. And by documents, I mean other publications about positional asphyxia. In one comment section on Valdosta Today, which is an online publication, Anderson made statements which shows that he doesn't understand how positional asphyxia is diagnosed. He said that the lungs should fill up with fluid. Well, that is not always the case, according to the publications that Mary Ann Gaffney Craft released. And she didn't write these publications. They are out there in the medical literature. But in these publications, it says that the diagnosis of positional asphyxia may or may not include the buildup of fluid in the lungs. And Johnson doesn't seem to understand that KJ's body was upside down and decompositional fluids were draining out of his lungs and his stomach, and that decompositional fluid is called purge. Anderson, as I showed you, said numerous times he was not beaten, but then he wants us to believe that a single pressure point application stopped his heart. But there's nothing in the way of physical evidence to support this single pressure application. The Johnson family claims that a dumbbell was dropped on KJ, but if that's true, then his body still had to get into the mat. And if the killers put him in the mat while he was still alive, there should have been marks on his ankles and wrists to show that that he was moved even in an unconscious state. And certainly if he died somewhere else, then the blood pooling would record that he died in a horizontal or prone position. But the blood pooling or lividity records that he died in a head down position. Therefore, he most likely died inside the mat, or rather he did die inside the mat. Now, he could have been unconscious when he went in there, but there's no evidence to indicate that. Okay, so, when a private pathologist says blunt force trauma, single pressure application, but then provides nothing to support that, why would anybody believe that when there's so much on the other side to prove positional asphyxia? Okay, so then Anderson's first autopsy, he claims to find the BFT, single pressure application. All right, so his autopsy and Marianne Gaffney Craft's autopsy are reviewed by two medical examiners from out of state. One was with the state of Maryland, one was with the Department of Defense. They reviewed them both, and they both agreed with Marianne Gaffney Craft, saying positional asphyxia. Later, one of these guys changed his finding to inconclusive, but that was after he was pressured by one of the DOJ attorneys, and I think the statement was, "I made him feel like a man." Now that is really bad for the DOJ attorney. Okay, the family hired William Anderson again in 2018, so people don't understand that it was the same exact private pathologist who did the third autopsy as well as the second autopsy. So basically he's coming back for another look 5 years later. And what he basically says is, and he doesn't write a report, he added an addendum. Basically, he said, "I missed something in the first one I conducted, but luckily for you, I found it in the second one I conducted 5 years later." So he'd have been shredded on the witness stand for this, because it goes to credibility and it goes to expertise if you find something that you missed. So Anderson's employment records after leaving the Florida Department of Law Enforcement are spotty. He jumps around a lot. You can find evidence of this on the web. I don't know if he's gone back to another state agency. It seems to me that he went to one for about a year, but then he went into private practice, and I think that's where he's been since. He's changed his conclusions in other private autopsies that he conducted. And there's a really strange case out there called the Eshdale Case, and I don't even know if I've spelled this correctly, but to me it sounded like the story in the movie Knives Out. And I don't claim to know the whole story, and I don't have time to go into it, and I'm not going to research it. But my initial review of it, there was a person who was related to a deceased person who had a large inheritance, and he didn't agree with the findings, which I can't remember what the person died of, but he hired Anderson to do a private autopsy. Anderson came back, and if memory serves, Anderson said no, it was murder due to a drug, due to drugs somehow. I don't remember the whole thing, but it sounded like the plot from Knives Out, because to the best of my understanding, if Anderson was correct, then this person would have been able to collect a large inheritance, which they were not going to collect if the initial conclusions from the state stood up to scrutiny. And I do not know what happened, but it was just bizarre. But there are other cases that I know of with Anderson's private work where he seems to just find this blunt force trauma as like a catch-all for anything that anybody that he looks at, and it's I wouldn't believe him, but that's just me. Okay, the problems with Marianne Gaffney Craft. Here's what I found. Basically, two subjects. Okay, so first of all, just know that she's with a state agency, and as far as I know, there's never been any problems with her. Not been fired, not been asked to resign. I didn't get her employment records because I figured if there was something wrong with her, the Kendrick Johnson family would find it, and then I could look into it. And I've showed you all the work I did with this. And I'm a volunteer. I don't make any money, and I've devoted hours and hours, and I just do it because I have a very strong belief in the truth, and I resent how it has been twisted by people who are trying to make money. The Johnsons are making money off their child's death, and there are podcasters and illegitimate citizen journalists who are making money off their child's death, and it disgusts me. So back to Mary Ann Gaffney Craft. Couldn't find anything bad about her, except her director for the state agency, GBI, Medical Examiner Office, he had to resign because he was caught double dipping. What the public needs to know is he did not conduct the Kendrick Johnson autopsy, nor was he present. And then here's the big controversy regarding the GBI autopsy. There is conflicting reports about what happened to the organs, and here's the best of my understanding. The GBI, we know, says that they released the organs with the body to the funeral home. The funeral home initially said the organs were never received, and that they were in fact disposed of by the GBI. But in later depositions, the funeral home says that the organs were disposed of at the funeral home because of advanced decomposition. What I personally think is there was a funeral home worker who disposed of them, and then because it became an issue, they just kept quiet about it because they thought they were going to get in trouble. But it is my understanding, because I wasn't there, because the Johnsons came back and they sued their funeral home director that they chose this funeral home because the owner was friends with with Jackie Johnson's father, and they sued him and claimed that he was part of the murder conspiracy and he threw away the organs to hide murder. So they deposed him. They were seeking money from him for disposing of the organs, and in the depositions, to the best of my knowledge, and I was told this, I can't go get these depositions because it's between two private entities. But I was told that the funeral home did say a funeral home worker disposed of them because of advanced decomposition. When the body was brought to the funeral home, it was at least 4 to 5 days dead at that point, and the body was 20 hours decomposing in the mat before he was found, and then the body, to the best of my knowledge, lay on the gymnasium floor while the scene was processed, and I think it lay there for at least 6, maybe more hours while the scene was processed. So it was a long time before the body was put in the body cooler, and then it had to be transported to the Macon GBI Medical Examiner Office, and then it had to be transported back. I do know that in Georgia there's no law that says that the organs, that you have to tell a family what you're doing with them if you're a funeral home, because a family is in a state of grief. We try to spare their feelings, so sometimes you just can't embalm them because they're just too decomposed or too liquefied. And so the best thing to do is dispose of them, because an open casket funeral, there's also health issues to the public that have to be considered here, as well as sensibility issues regarding smell. So, and I hate to use this language, but we're talking about a scientific process of decomposition and how to preserve biological tissue for a public open casket funeral, and certain biological things have to be dealt with. So there, like I said, there's no law that says, okay, you must tell the family what you're going to do with those organs. Well, in a lot of cases, whether there's a question of how the person died or not, the organs are disposed of. Regardless, however they're disposed of, the body cavity has to be filled with something for a viewing. And like I said, they wanted an open casket funeral. So best practice is sawdust or cotton, but the funeral home used newspaper. And I agree with the family. To me, that's just disrespectful, but it's not unlawful. And anyway, the family made a big deal out of this. They made a publicity stunt. They raised a lot of money saying, look what they did to our son. A lot of people have no idea what goes on in a funeral home, what goes on with a dead body. And they just automatically assumed that this was some kind of wicked procedure to hide how KJ died. And what the Kendrick Johnson family leaves out is that there was tissue samples taken from those organs. The organs were studied and analyzed at the GBI autopsy. Tissue samples were made. Those tissue samples are still available, and they were given to William Anderson. And neither of the two pathologists found anything wrong with the organs. Well, the first pathologist, Gabney Kraft, looked at the actual organs. The second pathologist looked at the tissue samples, and neither found anything wrong. Okay, so that's basically a comparison of the two. And here's what I found. Problems with Anderson, 2 pages. Problems with Marianne Gaffney Kraft, less than half a page. And one of them, it's not necessarily her autopsy, it's what happened to the organs after her autopsy. So you can get out there, research it yourself. I've showed you some places where you can look, or you can just do like the Johnsons do and get out there and make false accusations, and you can end up owing $300,000 like they owe for falsely accusing everyone, or you can owe $500,000 like Ebony had to pay for falsely accusing the Bell family, or you can do some actual research and stop acting like you know what happened when you haven't bothered to even read the first article from a legitimate journalist about it. Okay, take from it what you will.